The winter of 1884 arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a thief in the night, stealing the last vestiges of color from the high plains of Wyoming. It left behind a world sketched in charcoal and bone, a landscape that mirrored the stark geography of Arthur Blackwood's heart. His ranch was an island in a sea of frozen sagebrush and wind-scoured earth, the silence broken only by the keening of the wind around the eaves of his cabin and the low, mournful complaint of his few cattle huddled in the lean-to. Arthur was a man carved from the same hard material as the land he worked. His days were a ritual of thankless chores, a metronome of necessity that kept his mind from wandering into the shadowed country of memory. He mended fences that the wind sought to tear down, chopped wood until his hands were raw and his back ached with a satisfying burn, and tended his animals with a silent, methodical care. He moved through his life with the economy of a man who had nothing left to waste, least of all words or feelings. Grief was not a visitor in his home, it was a permanent resident. It sat with him at his small, scarred table as he ate his solitary meals. It lay beside him in the cold, empty space of his bed. 4 years prior, diphtheria had swept through their small homestead like a prairie fire, taking his wife, Eleanor, and their 2-year-old son, Thomas, in the space of a single, agonizing week. He had buried them himself on a small hill overlooking the creek, their graves marked by 2 simple wooden crosses that were now weathered to the same silver gray as the winter sky. In burying them, he had felt as though he were burying himself, entombing the man he used to be, the one who knew how to smile without effort, who believed in the simple promise of a shared future. What remained was a husk, functional and resilient, but hollowed out within. He had chosen this isolation deliberately. The nearby town of Redemption was a place he visited only when supplies ran dangerously low. The pitying glances of the townsfolk, their clumsy words of comfort, were like salt on a wound that refused to heal. They saw a man broken by loss, a tragic figure. He saw in their eyes a reflection of his own failure, a husband who could not protect his wife, a father who could not save his son. And so he retreated, finding a strange, bitter comfort in the vast emptiness that surrounded him, an emptiness that asked nothing of him and offered no false hope. His loneliness was a penance, a self-imposed sentence for a crime of which he was the only victim. The storm began as a whisper, a darkening on the northwestern horizon that Arthur had watched with a practiced eye for 2 days. By afternoon, the whisper had grown into a snarl. The sky turned the color of a deep bruise, and the wind began to howl like a thing grieving. Snow, fine and hard as sand, began to drive horizontally across the plains, erasing the horizon and shrinking the world down to the small, defiant circle of light cast by the lamp in his window. Arthur had finished his evening chores early, securing the livestock and banking the fire in the hearth. He sat at his table, a cup of weak coffee steaming in his hands, listening to the symphony of the blizzard. It was a sound he knew well, a force of nature that demanded respect and promised oblivion to any who dared challenge it. He felt a kinship with it, with its raw and untamable power. It was a fitting soundtrack to the winter of his own soul. A sound, faint and discordant, pricked the edges of the storm's roar. He stilled, head cocked. It was not the wind, it was something sharper, more desperate. He told himself it was an animal, a coyote caught in the open, but the sound came again, closer this time, and it was undeniably human. A cry, thin and raw, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. He stood, his chair scraping against the rough-hewn floorboards. A knot of irritation and unease tightened in his gut. No sane person would be out in this. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch. A profound reluctance held him there. Opening that door meant letting the world in, the chaotic, unpredictable world he had worked so hard to keep at bay. But the code of the frontier, an unwritten law more binding than any statute, was absolute. You did not turn your back on someone in need. Not in a storm like this. With a heavy sigh that plumed in the cold air of the cabin, he lifted the latch and pulled the door inward. The wind tore at him, a physical blow, driving a blast of stinging snow into the room. And there, collapsed on the threshold, was the source of the cry. It was a girl, hardly more than a child herself, her face pale and drawn against the rich, dark tangle of her hair. She was Native American, Cheyenne by the look of her beaded moccasins, which were worn through and soaked. Her clothes were thin, wholly inadequate for the brutal cold, and she was shivering uncontrollably. But it was not just the cold that racked her body. Her eyes, dark pools of exhaustion and pain, were fixed on something cradled in her arms, wrapped in a tattered blanket. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He saw the gleam of blood staining the snow beneath her, a stark, terrifying crimson against the white. He knelt, his own concerns vanishing in the face of such raw desperation. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The girl flinched at his voice, a wild, cornered look in her eyes. She tried to pull the bundle closer, a protective instinct that transcended her agony. He could see now that she was dying. It was not a judgment, but a simple, terrible fact. The life was draining out of her as surely as the heat was leaving the room. He reached out, not for her, but for the bundle. "Let me help you," he said, his voice softer this time. Inside, out of the storm. Her gaze shifted from the bundle to his face, a silent, searching appraisal. She must have seen something there, not pity, perhaps, but a weariness that matched her own because a fraction of the tension left her body. With a shuddering gasp, she relinquished her hold. As Arthur took the bundle, a tiny, mewling sound came from within it. His heart seized. It was a baby, a newborn, impossibly small, its face red and wrinkled. He stared down at it, a wave of vertigo washing over him. The past and present collided with brutal force. He was holding a life again, a fragile, helpless thing, and the ghost of his son, Thomas, rose up before him, a phantom of unbearable grief. He shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. The girl on his doorstep was fading. He gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. He laid her gently on the rag rug before the hearth, the baby still clutched in his other arm. He worked quickly, his movements clumsy but urgent. He added wood to the fire, stoked it until flames leaped high, casting a warm, flickering light over the scene. The baby began to cry in earnest now, a thin, reedy wail that pierced the roar of the wind. The girl on the floor stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked not at the fire, nor at her own state, but at the crying infant in his arms. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Her English was broken, labored. She pushed herself up onto one elbow, a feat of will that seemed to cost her everything. She reached a trembling hand toward the child. Arthur knelt beside her, bringing the baby closer. The girl's fingers brushed against the blanket, a touch of infinite tenderness and sorrow. Her eyes met his again, and in their depths he saw not fear of her own death, but a desperate, primal terror for the life she had just brought into the world. "No, safe," she breathed, her gaze flickering toward the door, toward the howling wilderness beyond. "They follow." He had no idea who they were, and there was no time to ask. Her strength was failing completely. Her head sank back to the floor. "Be, Father," she whispered, the words so quiet he almost missed them. Her eyes, wide and pleading, held his. It was not a question. It was a command, a prayer, a final, desperate act of a mother's love. Her hand slipped from the blanket and fell to the floor. A last, shuddering breath escaped her lips, and she was still. The silence she left behind was more profound than the one he had so carefully cultivated. It was a heavy, weighted silence, filled with the presence of death and the piercing cry of a new life. Arthur Blackwood, the man who had walled himself off from the world, sat on the floor of his cabin, the firelight dancing on the face of a dead girl, with a stranger's baby screaming in his arms. The storm raged outside, but a far greater one had just broken within him. For a long time, he did not move. He was frozen, trapped between the body at his feet and the squirming, wailing infant in his arms. The baby's cries were a physical assault, scraping at the raw edges of his soul, demanding a response he did not know how to give. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in his throat. He wanted to set the child down, to run out into the blizzard and let it scour him clean of this impossible responsibility. This was not his burden. He had carried his share of grief, he could not carry this too. But the girl's last words echoed in the roaring silence. "Be, Father," a plea that had become a verdict. He looked down at the tiny, furious face, at the miniature fists waving in the air. This was not an abstract problem. It was a life, utterly dependent and fragile. To abandon it would be a cruelty his hardened heart could not yet stomach. It would be a betrayal not only of the dying girl's trust, but of some fundamental part of himself, he thought, long dead. With a groan, he rose to his feet. The first task was the most terrible. He couldn't leave her there, on the floor of his home. Gently, he lifted the girl's body and carried her into his own cold bedroom, laying her on the bed he had once shared with Eleanor. He covered her with a clean sheet, a small, inadequate gesture of respect. On her person, he found nothing but a small, beaded leather pouch, tightly closed. He hesitated, then tucked it into his pocket. He would not rifle through a dead woman's things. He closed the door, shutting away the sight, but not the reality of what had happened. The next morning, the blizzard had broken, leaving behind a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun glittered on a pristine blanket of deep snow. The world was beautiful and dead. Arthur worked for 2 hours, his muscles straining in the frigid air, to dig a grave in the frozen earth of the small hill where his family lay. He wrapped the girl in one of his own clean blankets and carried her there. He said no words as he lowered her into the ground. He did not know her name, her story, her gods. He could offer no prayers. He could only offer a piece of his land, a final, quiet resting place next to his own lost hopes. As he shoveled the last mound of earth over the grave, he felt a profound and desolate kinship with the unnamed Cheyenne girl. Both of them had lost everything. Returning to the cabin was like entering a foreign country. The air was filled with a new smell, a mixture of milk and something uniquely infant. The baby, whom he had left wrapped in blankets in a wooden crate near the fire, was awake and beginning to fuss. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of an avalanche. He was alone, miles from any other soul, with a newborn baby. He knew how to break a horse, how to read the sky, how to survive a winter. He knew nothing about keeping a child alive. The first days were a blur of desperate improvisation and sheer panic. Feeding was the most immediate challenge. He had a milk cow, but her milk was too rich. He remembered hearing somewhere that it needed to be watered down, maybe with a little sugar. He spent hours trying to get the baby to drink from a strip of clean cloth dipped in the warm, sweetened liquid. More of it ended up on the baby's face and his own hands than in her stomach. Her frustrated, hungry wails were a constant judgment on his inadequacy. He learned the rhythms of her needs through grueling trial and error. He changed her with strips of an old flour sack, his large, calloused hands fumbling with the task. He learned to interpret her cries, the sharp, demanding shriek of hunger, the fretful whimper of discomfort, the lonely, desolate cry that could only be soothed by being held. It was the holding that changed things. In the long, dark hours of the night, when the loneliness was a physical presence in the room, he would pick her up from her crate and sit in his chair by the fire, holding her against his chest. He could feel the frantic, tiny beat of her heart against his own steady, tired one. He felt the warmth of her small body seeping into him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Her crying would soften, replaced by small, contented sounds as she burrowed into the rough fabric of his shirt. He started to talk to her, his voice at first a self-conscious rumble in the quiet cabin. He told her about the ranch, about the way the light hit the mountains in the morning. He told her about Eleanor, about her laugh that sounded like wind chimes. He told her about Thomas, about the boy's fascination with a shiny pocket watch. He spoke of his grief, giving it words for the first time in years, whispering his secrets to the only living soul who could not judge him. The baby would listen, her dark, solemn eyes fixed on his face, and in those moments, the crushing weight on his chest would lighten, just a little. He realized with a jolt that she needed a name. Calling her the baby felt wrong, impersonal. He thought of her mother, of the wild courage it must have taken to fight her way through a blizzard to save her child. He thought of the impossible hope she had placed in him, a stranger. He thought of the new day that broke after the storm, clean and full of harsh, bright promise. "Dawn," he whispered one evening as she slept on his chest. "I'll call you Dawn." The name felt right. It tasted of new beginnings. He pulled the beaded pouch from his pocket and opened it. Inside was not a weapon or a trinket of value, but a single perfect eagle feather and a bundle of dried herbs whose scent was sweet and earthy. It was a mother's legacy, a connection to a world he did not know. He placed it carefully on the mantelpiece, a sacred thing in his profane home. A week bled into two, and a fragile routine took hold. Arthur's life was no longer his own. It revolved entirely around this tiny, demanding creature. His solitude was broken, the silence filled with her gurgles and cries. He found himself watching her for hours, marveling at the way her fingers, delicate as spiderwebs, would curl around his own rough digit. He was exhausted, perpetually worried, and more alive than he had been in 4 years. The hollow space inside him was not gone, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with a terrifying, fierce, and burgeoning love. But the world outside his small haven could not be kept at bay forever. His supplies were running low. Flour, salt, sugar, the necessities of life were dwindling. He had to go to redemption. The thought filled him with a cold dread. How could he explain her? A man like him, alone, suddenly in possession of a native baby. The town was a place of narrow minds and sharp tongues. They would not see a man trying to honor a dying wish. They would see something sordid, something criminal. He postponed the trip for as long as he could, but finally the day came when he had no choice. He bundled Dawn so tightly in blankets that only the tip of her nose was visible, securing her in a sling he had fashioned from a horse blanket so she could rest against his chest. The warmth of her body was a small comfort against the anxiety churning in his stomach. The ride to town was cold, the air crisp and clean. The beauty of the snow-covered landscape felt like a mockery of the ugliness he anticipated. Redemption was just as he remembered. A single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings huddled against the vastness of the prairie. As he dismounted in front of the general store, he could feel the eyes on him. Windows twitched, conversations ceased. He pulled his hat down low and pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his unwelcome arrival. The store was warm and smelled of coffee, leather, and dried apples. Martha Prescott, the proprietor's wife, stood behind the counter, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. She was a woman who found her purpose in the judgment of others. Her eyes immediately fell on the bundle strapped to Arthur's chest. "Blackwood," she said, her voice thin and sharp. "Didn't expect to see you before the thaw." Her gaze lingered on the bundle. "What is that you're carrying?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "Supplies, Martha. I need flour and coffee." He tried to keep his voice even, to betray none of the turmoil inside him. "It moved," she said, her eyes narrowing. "There's something alive in there." From within the blankets, Dawn let out a small, sleepy whimper. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet store. Martha's face hardened from suspicion to outright hostility. A few other customers, a pair of ranchers near the stove, turned to stare openly. "Good Lord," Martha breathed, a hand flying to her chest in theatrical shock. "Is that a baby?" Arthur knew there was no point in lying. He squared his shoulders. "Her name is Dawn." "Yours?" The word was an accusation. The implication hung heavy in the air, that he had consorted with a native woman, that this child was the product of sin. "She's in my care," he said, his voice hard as granite. It was the only truth he could offer. The story, or rather the town's version of it, spread through redemption like a fever. Arthur Blackwood, the grieving recluse, had emerged from his hermitage with an Indian baby. By the time he had collected his supplies and made his way to the sheriff's office to file a claim on a stray calf, the whispers followed him down the street. He was a kidnapper. He was a degenerate. The child was stolen, a half-breed, a savage. The prejudice was a palpable thing, an invisible wall he could feel pressing in on him. Sheriff Callahan was a different sort of man. He was pragmatic, his face a roadmap of long years spent dealing with the harsh realities of the frontier. He listened as Arthur gave a heavily edited version of the story that he had found the baby, her mother having perished in the storm. He left out the plea, the intimacy of the moment. It was too sacred to be offered up for public consumption. Callahan rubbed his jaw, his eyes assessing Arthur carefully. "That's a heavy burden to take on, Blackwood. A child, especially, one like that. Folks around here won't make it easy for you." "I'm aware," Arthur said flatly. "I'm not asking for their approval. I'm just trying to keep her alive." "Be careful," the sheriff warned, his tone serious. "There's some bad blood with the Cheyenne bands up north. A couple of prospectors, Vance and McBride, had a run-in with them last fall. Claimed they were attacked. They stir up trouble wherever they go, and they ain't got no love for the natives." The names meant nothing to Arthur, but the warning settled like a cold stone in his gut. As he rode out of town, with dawn warm against his chest, he felt a new kind of fear. It was not the fear of loneliness or failure, but the fear of a world that would seek to harm this innocent child simply for the crime of her birth. He had thought the blizzard was the greatest danger they faced. He was wrong. The storm of human hatred was far more dangerous. He looked down at the sleeping bundle. Her mother had said, "They follow." He was beginning to understand what she meant. The ride back to the ranch was charged with a new urgency. The isolation that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a vulnerability. He was one man, alone, against a world that saw his new purpose as a perversion. The weight of his responsibility settled more heavily on his shoulders, but it was a different kind of weight now. It was not the dead weight of grief, but the living weight of purpose. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a father protecting his child. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He urged his horse onward, racing the setting sun, eager for the defiant safety of his four walls. The weeks that followed Arthur's trip to town were a period of uneasy peace. Spring began to assert itself, a slow, grudging thaw that turned the snow to slush and the earth to mud. Life on the ranch settled into a new, more complicated rhythm. Dawn was growing, changing. Her dark eyes followed him around the cabin, and she had begun to make small, cooing sounds that Arthur answered as if they were engaged in serious conversation. He carved a small, smooth bird out of a piece of cottonwood for her, and she would hold it in her tiny fist, her face a mask of concentration. The love he felt for her was a fierce, protective ache in his chest, a thing so powerful, it frightened him. But the warning from Sheriff Callahan lingered in the back of his mind. He found himself scanning the horizon more often, his hands straying to the shotgun he now kept loaded and propped near the door. The peace felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river. He was living on borrowed time. The trouble arrived on a grey, overcast afternoon. Arthur was outside, mending a harness on the porch, while Dawn slept inside in her crate. He heard the sound of approaching horses long before he saw them, the squelch of hooves in the thick mud. Two riders emerged from the cottonwoods by the creek. They were not neighbors. They were rough-looking men with hard eyes and several days' worth of stubble on their jaws. One was tall and wiry, the other thick-set and brutish. Arthur's hand instinctively went to the shotgun resting against the cabin wall. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice steady, though his heart had begun to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs. The men reined in their horses. The wiry one, who Arthur guessed was Vance, gave a slow, unpleasant smile. "Just being neighborly," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality. Heard you took in some company, a little stray. What I do on my land is my business, Arthur said, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The second man, McBride, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the mud. We heard it was a little savage brat. We had some trouble with her kind a few months back. Lost a partner to 'em. We're just here to make sure accounts are settled. Arthur's blood ran cold. They follow. The dying girl's words. These were the men. They hadn't been attacked. They had been the attackers. And the girl, Vivina, had been running from them, carrying her baby, a living witness to their crimes. There's no one here you have business with, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Turn your horses around and ride out. Vance's smile vanished. We ain't leaving without the child. It's an unnatural thing, a white man raising one of them. We'd be doing you a favor, cleaning up a mess. The raw, unveiled hatred in his voice ignited something in Arthur, a cold fury that burned away the last vestiges of his passive grief. This was not about prejudice anymore. This was about murder. They wanted to silence the last piece of a family they had already destroyed. Over my dead body, Arthur said, the words tasting like iron in his mouth. He raised the shotgun, the twin barrels aimed squarely at Vance's chest. For a moment, there was a tense standoff. The only sounds were the chuffing of the horses and the low moan of the wind. Then, with a sudden, sharp cry, Dawn woke up inside the cabin. The sound broke the spell. Vance's eyes darted toward the cabin door, a flicker of vicious triumph in them. There it is, he hissed. In a flash, he drew his pistol. Arthur fired without thinking. The shotgun blast roared through the quiet afternoon, a deafening explosion of sound and fury. He hadn't aimed to kill, but to startle the horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing Vance from the saddle. McBride, seeing his partner go down, cursed and spurred his own horse forward, drawing his gun. Arthur didn't have time to reload. He dove from the porch, rolling in the mud as a bullet splintered the wood where he had been standing. He scrambled behind the water trough, his mind racing. He was no gunslinger. This was not a fair fight. It was a desperate scramble for survival. McBride dismounted, using his horse for cover as he advanced toward the cabin. Nowhere to run, Blackwood. Give us the baby, and we'll let you live. Arthur knew it was a lie. From inside, Dawn's cries grew louder, more terrified. The sound fueled his resolve. He risked a glance over the trough. Vance was getting to his feet, dazed but alive, fumbling for his lost pistol in the mud. Arthur knew he had only seconds. He remembered the woodpile, stacked high against the side of the cabin. It was a risky move, but his only one. As McBride edged closer to the porch, Arthur bolted from behind the trough, sprinting not toward the man, but toward the corner of the cabin. McBride wheeled and fired, the bullet whizzing past Arthur's ear with a sound like an angry hornet. Arthur reached the woodpile and, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, shoved against the retaining logs. The entire stack, cords of heavy, seasoned pine, collapsed with a thunderous crash, an avalanche of timber that cascaded directly into McBride's path. The man yelled in surprise and pain as logs slammed into him, knocking him off his feet and pinning his leg beneath their immense weight. His pistol clattered away onto the muddy ground. Before Arthur could feel a sliver of relief, a shape loomed up behind him. Vance. He had found his gun. Arthur turned, but he was too late. Vance swung the heavy barrel of his pistol, catching Arthur on the side of the head. Pain, brilliant and blinding, exploded behind his eyes. The world tilted, the grey sky spinning as he staggered and fell to his knees. Vance stood over him, panting, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "You stubborn fool," he snarled, raising the pistol to point it at Arthur's head. Through the ringing in his ears and the haze of pain, Arthur looked past the man, toward the cabin door. He had failed. He had fought, but he had failed. The image of Dawn's face, her trusting eyes, flashed in his mind. A wave of despair, blacker than any he had ever known, washed over him. Then another sound cut through the air. not a gunshot, but the sharp crack of a rifle. Vance's eyes went wide with shock. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it in disbelief. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed into the mud, his pistol falling from his lifeless hand. Arthur stared, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Sheriff Callahan emerged from the trees, a smoking rifle in his hands. He must have been following the men, or perhaps someone in town had sent for him after seeing the unsavory pair ride out in Arthur's direction. Callahan walked forward, his face grim. He nudged Vance's body with his boot, then looked over at McBride, who was groaning and cursing from beneath the woodpile. Finally, his eyes settled on Arthur, who was still on his knees, blood trickling down the side of his face. "Told you to be careful, Blackwood," the sheriff said, his voice devoid of any judgment. He glanced at the cabin, from which Dawn's cries were still emanating. "Looks like you had your reasons." The tension and terror of the last few minutes drained out of Arthur all at once, leaving him weak and trembling. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, and stumbled toward the cabin door. Nothing else mattered. He pushed it open and went inside. Dawn was wailing in her crate, her small body rigid with fear. He lifted her out, his hands shaking, and held her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her blanket. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's all right. I've got you. Papa's got you." He sank into his chair, heedless of the sheriff outside or the dead man in his yard. He just held his daughter, rocking her gently, his tears mixing with the blood on his cheek until her cries subsided into shuddering breaths and she fell into an exhausted sleep against the steady, protective beat of his heart. The aftermath of the violence was a quiet, somber affair. Sheriff Callahan, with a stoicism born of long practice, dealt with the grim necessities. He bound the injured McBride, slung the body of Vance over his own horse, and listened as Arthur, his head bandaged with a strip of cloth, recounted the attack in a flat, tired voice. There were no more questions, no more suspicions in the sheriff's eyes. He had seen the truth written in mud and blood in Arthur's yard. He had seen a father defending his child. "The circuit judge will want a statement when he comes through next month," Callahan said as he prepared to leave. "But as far as I'm concerned, this was self-defense. You did what any man would do." He paused, looking from Arthur to the sleeping baby in his arms. "You take care of that little one. Seems she's already seen more trouble than most folks see in a lifetime." With that, he tipped his hat and led his grim procession away from the ranch, leaving Arthur and Dawn in a silence that felt earned and profound. The ugly intrusion of the world had been repelled, at least for now. Arthur knew the whispers in town might not cease entirely, but something had shifted. He had been tested, and he had not been found wanting. He had proven his right to be her father, not by blood, but by battle. Spring finally arrived in earnest, washing the world clean. The last of the snow melted, feeding the creek until it ran full and boisterous. The prairie grasses turned a vibrant green, and wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and bluebells dotted the landscape like tiny jewels. The air grew soft and warm, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. The changing of the seasons mirrored the change within Arthur Blackwood. The wound on his head healed, leaving a faint scar at his temple that he hardly noticed. But the deeper wounds, the ones that had festered in the silence of his soul for 4 long years, had also begun to mend. The arrival of Dawn had not erased his grief for Eleanor and Thomas, nothing ever could, but it had made space for something new to grow alongside it: hope. His days were no longer a monotonous march against sorrow. They were filled with the small, miraculous moments of watching a child discover the world. He would carry Dawn on his hip as he did his chores, pointing out the cows, the soaring hawk, the shimmer of light on the creek. Her first smile was an event more momentous than any storm, a brilliant, gummy grin that lit up her whole face and made Arthur's heart ache with a joyful, unfamiliar pang. Her first laugh, a bubbling, gurgling sound in response to him making a funny face, was the sweetest music he had ever heard. He sat on the porch one warm evening, the setting sun painting the sky in strokes of orange and rose. Dawn sat in his lap, playing with the simple wooden bird he had carved for her. He looked out at the small hill where 3 graves now lay. He no longer saw it as just a place of loss. It was a place of beginnings, too. A place where a desperate mother had made a final, hopeful plea, entrusting her entire world to a stranger. Her name was Vivina, he said softly to Dawn, though she was too young to understand. He had learned it from Sheriff Callahan, who had gotten the story out of a penitent and pain-filled McBride. That was your mother's name. It means good woman in the language of her people. And she was brave, the bravest woman I ever met. He pulled the beaded leather pouch from the mantelpiece, where he kept it safe. He opened it and showed Dawn the single, perfect eagle feather. "She left this for you," he murmured. "So you'd remember. I'll keep it safe until you're old enough. I'll tell you all about her. I'll tell you how she fought through a blizzard to bring you to me, to give you a chance." Dawn reached out a tiny hand and touched the feather, her dark eyes wide with innocent curiosity. In that moment, Arthur felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet contentment that he had once believed was lost to him forever. The harsh, empty landscape that had once mirrored his soul now seemed full of life and promise. His cabin was no longer a fortress of solitude, but a home, filled with the sounds and warmth of a family. He was not the same man who had opened the door to the storm months ago. That man was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell. This man, the one holding a child in his arms as the sky bruised into nightfall, was someone new. He was a father. He had been given a second chance not to replace what he had lost, but to build something new upon the foundations of his grief. The lonely cowboy was gone. In his place was Arthur Blackwood, a man who had found his redemption not in a town of that name, but in the desperate, last-minute plea of a dying girl and the fierce, unexpected love for the daughter she had left behind. He held Dawn closer, breathing in the sweet scent of her, and watched as the first stars began to appear in the vast, quiet sky.